Well, we're talking end times still as we're in our devotional series of the Gospel of Mark. We find ourselves in chapter 13, which is a heavy prophetic chapter. And so we're going to just spend some time wrestling with some of these big ticket items that Jesus is talking about. Hi, Pastor Andrew here. Thank you so much for continuing to join us in this series. Now, this portion of the series builds on itself. We've been going through the whole Gospel of Mark, but we're going to take a little bit more time in chapter 13 because it's so provocative and so interesting. I hope that you recognize they'll build on each other, these sessions. So this is session 13.5. I hope that you'll take the time to go back if you haven't and watch 13.1, 13.2, 3, and 4 because they build on themselves. And what we're saying here will make even more sense. And we're approaching this end times conversation a little bit differently through the lens of, if you're sort of a first-time reader, you're reading through the Gospel of Mark, you come to chapter 13, and then there's all of these big ticket items. Maybe you're not familiar with prophecy and all of that stuff. How do you handle this? Where do you go to find information and all of that? We've been unpacking that along the way. Where do you look and all that kind of stuff? Important to start is that there are parallel passages to this conversation called the Olivet Discourse. And the parallel passages are Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21. Read those carefully to get your arms around what Jesus is talking about from beginning to end of this section of Scripture. So now we move on to this very interesting, curious, provocative term, the Abomination of Desolation, that Jesus uses in Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and Luke 21. And he seems to use something that happened long ago from where Jesus is sitting. Again, this conversation on the Mount of Olives took place early 30s AD. And so he's, from that vantage point, he's using a past event to describe something or talk about something that would happen in the future from where they're sitting and they're talking. So what is this abomination of desolation? What happened? Did it happen in the future? Like Jesus said from his vantage point? These would be great questions for a new reader to ask. What is it? Tell me all about it. Let me read all about it. And then did it happen again? Because Jesus says, when you see, that certainly seems to be future when he uses that phrase. Well, the Abomination of Desolation, we have several historical documents to teach us about what that is in history. The Abomination of Desolation was an event that happened in Jewish history, which they were all well aware of. Now, there's going to be multiple parts to this, so stay with me. I'm calling this the Abomination of Desolation because it sort of had that title, but I should say this is the event that is most commonly fit into this title, the Abomination of Desolation. Okay, so this event took place about 169, 168 BC. Okay, so you're not going to read about it in Scripture per se, because the Hebrew Scriptures, or what we call the Old Testament, Malachi is the last book of the Old Testament, written and completed about 400 BC. And then we open the New Testament. All of a sudden, Rome is on the scene. They're the superpower of the day. We're reading about all of these events that are happening in the first century. So there's a period of time of about 400 years between the Old and New Testament. It's called the intertestamental period, where a lot happens historically, but we don't read about it in Scripture. You can, however, read about it in a couple books called 1st and 2nd Maccabees. These are historical accounts of these events that took place. And so you can read about this event that we're calling the Abomination of Desolation, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. The Jewish historian Josephus also writes about it in detail in his works. And again, he was a first century historian writing about these things as well. So here's basically what happened. And again, with history, it gets very complicated and moving parts and nations and, this leader's trying to take over from this leader, and then these guys are following this. It gets complicated. We'll try to stay out of that and just focus on the basics. A very wicked leader in that region was named Antiochus IV. Okay, he hated the Jews. He hated their religion. Through a rather long and involved story, Antiochus IV wanted to end the Jewish practices in the temple, and he went through great lengths to completely desecrate the temple. Horrible, horrible time for the Jews. Okay, we read in 2 Maccabees chapter 6 that the oppression was harsh and almost intolerable. Gentiles, and as you may remember, a Gentile is anyone who is not a Jew. Gentiles filled the temple with drinking parties and all sorts of immorality. They had intercourse with prostitutes there in the temple. Forbidden objects were brought into the temple, and the altar was covered with detestable sacrifices prohibited by our law. That is the law of Moses, the Mosaic law. It was impossible to observe the Sabbath, to celebrate any of our traditional festivals, or even so much as to admit to being a Jew. And pagan sacrifices were demanded. Antiochus IV went into the temple. He placed a statue of Zeus, a Greek god, pagan god, there in the temple. And then he offered a pig in sacrificed a pig on the altar in the temple. Man, as you may know, or it's important to know, that a pig was an unclean animal that the Jews didn't even eat, let alone offer as an item of worship or a sacrifice of worship to God. So this was an abomination that left the temple desolate, unusable, dirty, unclean, unfit for use. This event, wicked, hateful, malicious, this event by Antiochus IV desecrated the temple, called the abomination that left desolate, or the Abomination of Desolation. This led to a revolt, actually, by a group of Jews, and ultimately a prolonged ceremony where the temple was consecrated yet again. And incidentally, this is where the Jewish celebration of Hanukkah originated. But there was a revolt that took place, important in Jewish history. But that event, the desecration of the temple, and then later on down the road, they were able to reconsecrate it. But that was the Abomination of Desolation. That is what Jesus is talking about. And it took place some 130 years before or earlier from where Jesus and the disciples are talking. Remember, they're sitting on the Mount of Olives. It's about early 30s AD. And so Jesus is saying, when you see the Abomination of Desolation, which is referring back to something from where he's standing that happened 130 years ago. And here's where it gets really, really intriguing, because here's how Matthew puts it. Jesus says, so when you see the Abomination of Desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, or by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, and then in parentheses, let the reader understand. Now, we see this in Matthew and in Mark. Let the reader understand. Probably not something Jesus said, but it's a note from Matthew, it's a note from Mark, in parentheses. Jesus just said this, let the reader understand. Think about what Jesus just said. When you see, and then he refers to something that happened in the past. Already, this sentence sort of makes your head spin for a moment. Isn't that interesting? Daniel, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, is a book of the Bible, and was a prophet. And he was alive and wrote about 600 BC. Daniel lived sort of during that Babylonian exile, and after the destruction of the first temple that I talked about a couple sessions ago. Daniel was a prophet, profound prophet. So he wrote his stuff in 600 BC, and he alludes to this abomination that leaves desolate. And a lot of scholars will say, man, what an incredible prediction. It was fulfilled some 500 years later, 400 years later, in 168, 169 BC, with Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, just desecrating the temple. And so this event of desecrating the temple by the king, Antiochus, happened at that point in time, 169, 168, and Jesus is talking about it in the 30s. So the time frame is important, the timeline. You can see how this is so trippy, right? So this is where opinions begin to split on how to understand this passage. And here's why. Because we have to keep asking questions. So we know that Jesus uses a historical event, but he's saying, when you see this, which is future, run for the hills. And he says, spoken of by Daniel the prophet. So now we have more questions brought into our conversation. What is the context of Daniel's Old Testament prophecy regarding the Abomination of Desolation? Is the event that happened with Antiochus, the final and ultimate fulfillment of this statement by Jesus? Why did Jesus speak to this as future from where he was standing? And then really, did the destruction of the temple in 70 AD fulfill any or all of this? These are important questions because, as you remember, Jesus said there will be a time of tribulation that will be unlike anything since the creation of the world, nor will there ever be. So does that fit, right? Do the things that we know fit that, especially the destruction of the temple in 70 AD? Isn't that interesting? It's a very provocative verse by Jesus. So we have a lot more to unpack. I hope that you'll stay with us as we continue to trudge through this. We'll look a little bit at Daniel, and by unpacking a little bit of Daniel, we're going to end up having to jump over to Revelation a little bit. And then hopefully we'll be able to wrap up a little bit of sort of this umbrella, sort of big ticket item view from starting in Mark chapter 13. It's interesting how that stuff works together by taking just baby step. What about this? What about this? How does this work? And pulling things together. I hope you'll stay with us. We'll see you next time.